specific sequence in order for all of this to take place. Now, the advantage of having hindsight is that it's always 2020. Isn't it amazing how it worked out perfectly the way that it was? Now, if it had been differently, it would have been perfect that way as well. But this perfect story that God lays out about the salvation of the Jews that were living in Persia is a marvel. Let me give you some background. First of all, we have all of the exiles that are living throughout all of the known world, and many of them had been either taken captive or were now living in the capital city of Susa in Persia. And in that city, it had grown, and now Xerxes is now king of most of the known world. There's 127 provinces that he oversees, and there are Jewish people living in all of those. So you can see that this dispersion, this dissemination of all the people out of Judah, now throughout most of the known world, is going to have a consequence. Now, perhaps we can look at that as God saying, well, this is your punishment. We're going to break you apart and send you out all over. When I was pastoring the church in Flint, we closed that church. And we took a little bit different approach. All those people were no longer at Bethany Community Church in Flint. And that was sad. But we took a little approach that said, now it is your opportunity to take everything that you've learned here, all of the skills, all of the talents, all of the friendships, all of the things that had come together, and you can take those to other congregations and pretty much infect them with all of the things that we learned to do. And that's what we did. So let's take a look at our lesson this morning. It comes to us from Esther, the 4th chapter. And it's this chapter that's the pivotal one that talks to us about Esther's response to all of this calamity. Now he gave them a copy of the text of the edict. Now this is the one that Haman had written out for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa to show Esther, and explained it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence. Now this is Mordecai. Mordecai is Esther's cousin, much older cousin, who has adopted her after the death of her parents. And he says, go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for all her people. Hatach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. The 30 days had passed since I called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days or 3 nights. I and my attendants will fast even as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, well, then I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Nancy's in the other room with Katie going through I Wonder stories. Telling the very same story, but then asking her, I wonder what it would be like to be Esther. I wonder what it would be like to know that your life is in jeopardy, that if you go to the king without him calling you, you could die. I wonder what it would be like just to stay silent and try to save yourself. And I hope that you wonder these things too. As a preacher, we always hope that you're wondering, that you're questioning, and that occasionally we're answering questions that you might be asking. Well, let me give you a question that you ought to be asking. What if you were placed here for just such a time as this? Now, that's the same question that Mordecai is asking Esther, isn't it? What if all of this string of events were put into place by God to bring you to this place here and now? Because God has something important for you to do here. What if? What if Esther had not listened? What if Esther had said, you don't understand, Mordecai. If I go to the king, I'm dead. And just because I'm his wife doesn't mean that I can go to the king. So I'm not going to do it. That means all of God's plans would have been stopped, right? Darling, no. She's right. Do you think God would have been stopped if Esther would have said no? Do you think God's plans would have changed if Esther would have said no? Yeah. Do you remember the instructions that Jesus gave in the New Testament? And all of the officials were telling his followers, tell your followers to keep silent. And Jesus replied to them, if I tell them to keep silent, God will raise up voices from the stones of the earth to sing praises. Now, I don't really think that God is going to have stones develop mouths and start talking. That's not the point. The point is, God can take the impossible and he will make it his own, and he will raise up a new solution. And if you silence all the current voices, God will just raise up more. If Haman could have his way and Esther would remain silent and Mordecai would be extinguished, God would just raise up another solution. Kind of reminds me of the old Star Trek series with the Borg. Resisting is futile. You can resist God. You can tell God no. You can walk away from God, and God is still going to come up with a solution. Why? Because our God is persistent. He doesn't give up, and we ought to know that by now. All of the things that Nancy was talking to Katie about are true. The Old Testament is filled with example after example after example after example of people doing bad things. Now, one of the horrible things that preachers do to all of you, and this is my confession time. Okay, take notes. Not going to come often. Is we give you bite-sized pieces of Scripture. Why is that a bad thing? Because when all you see is a little bit of Scripture, one sentence, one verse, even one paragraph, you get the idea that these things all are unrelated. They sit alone, and it makes no sense at all. And you walk out of this place on Sunday mornings and you feel confused, and that's our fault. Not because we weren't clear with the message. I think most of the time we are. But because all we've given you is just one little piece. We've never given you the entire view, the big picture. Now, I hope